Pan's Labyrinth. Guillermo del Toro's 2006 fantasy drama is a winner of the BAFTA for Best Film Not in English, along with 3 Academy Awards and numerous other accomplishments. The film is praised largely for its visuals, which were crafted with care, but also for the way it explores the philosophy of the fairy tale. It uses its visuals to gesture towards nearly every corner of the body of preceding fantasy literature, partly to celebrate it, and partly to critique it. To Del Toro, blind obedience is a sin, which is about the opposite of the message one would expect from a fairy tale. Yet it is this philosophy that drives Pan's Labyrinth. Critics have described the film as glorious, exquisite, a tour de force, one of the greatest of all fantasy films, and a Citizen Kane of fantasy cinema. This video essay is not about that film. There was another film before Pan's Labyrinth to have a mature understanding of skepticism and belief, to reflect on fantasy's history using intertextual imagery, and to be a fairy tale for adults. 20 years prior, in 1986, another artistic visionary released the film hailed by critics as really quite awful, a crashing bore, and a remarkable achievement. Critics are generally agreed on what Pan's Labyrinth is all about, but this film is a puzzle. It is at once a masterpiece and a disaster, a perplexing and bizarre one-of-a-kind spectacle, and the time has come for this film to receive serious critical examination. This is Jim Henson's cinematic magnum opus, Labyrinth.
I'm not totally sure I'm believing what I'm seeing at the moment. And I think Prince Charles feels the same.
Trying to make some sense of him.
To be quite serious, it is a brilliant, brilliant monster.
He is, he's lovely.
He's so lifelike.
So
look at the way he's frowning now. Wondering what's going on.
Don't you think that has to be the picture of tomorrow's papers?
Yes.
When Labyrinth was first released in theaters, it was not a success, and yet, Fathom Events brought it back to theaters 30 years later because it has become a cult classic. Some would say it's more than that.
It is now known to be one of the most successful fantasy movies ever made.
From comic books to cosplay, Labyrinth has become a part of convention culture, an important feature of 80s nostalgia, as we can see from Ready Player One's poster parody. It's strange for a flop to receive this kind of attention, but Labyrinth benefited from being released on home video at exactly the right time, just when everyone would be able to see it on VHS. Consequently, a variety of content creators on the internet have approached the film to try to figure out what to make of it. Why does it resonate with people? And what does it mean?
Yeah. So this is like such a weird combination, right? Like this is a Jim Henson puppet joint. It's a George Lucas produced film starring David Bowie.
Yep. Sponsored by marijuana. Yeah, it's got a lot of just that same kind of 80s weirdness, like that very dark, like, you watch it now and you're like, why would you ever show this to children unless you were mad at them? Like, there's that part with the hands,
oh my
like
God,
the touchy-feely wall.
Oh my God, that's like... Oh, the touchy-feely wall, I forgot about that.
Yeah, they're like reaching out
they're like groping her.
Yeah.
And like, it's shot very suggestively. Yeah. Like, you see a lot of David Bowie's business. And he has a lot of business. He has a multitude of business.
He's open for business.
He is absolutely
Business is booming. You know, I haven't seen that movie in a long time, and I can still see that one scene with his pants.
The typical response to the film from YouTube commentators is simply joking about how the film presents sexuality with David Bowie's character, usually with the assumption that this must be somehow secret or even accidental because, well, it's a Jim Henson film.
No, Your Majesty.
Okay, you're actually giving us that visual, huh? You just had to move one phallic device closer to another phallic device.
I'm not sure this is a kid's movie. I'm gonna have to consult my Bruno Bettelheim about Bowie bulges and female-centric fairy tales.
Labyrinth, to be clear, is not a kid's movie.
Yeah, Labyrinth was a special movie because it was not really a kid's movie.
It is never safe to assume that anything made by Jim Henson must have been made for children. He never limited himself in that regard. As for the common accusation that Bowie's pants were simply too tight, his costume had a codpiece built into it. This is no accident, this was very important to Jim Henson.
You should have seen Brian's drawings. Brian's designs was like, that codpiece just got bigger and bigger. And my dad was like, this is great, it's like terrifying to a teenage girl. Like, you know, That was what he was, because he was like, this is great, this is what the movie's about. You know, she's like 15, she wants to be treated like an adult, but whoa, that thing's scary.
That being said, this treatment of the film is to be expected from comedy videos made for YouTube, since the purpose of these videos is to make people laugh. More academic or formal analyses of the film, however, are often not much more analytically rigorous than their YouTube counterparts. These often appear in texts compiling essays on Jim Henson, so the focus tends to be on how great Jim Henson was. There are essays that look at the film from a particular critical angle to point out philosophical ideas that may be suggested by the film, themes of escapism, environmentalism, or life not being fair, but it is rare to find a text that works to understand the film holistically, probably because the film is so strange and confusing.
The picture is not specifically any one thing, and so it's very easy for a viewer to project their own issues onto the film. When it was first made, I remember Jim asked me what I thought of the script before we got into production, and I said, gee, I don't think she's very sympathetic. The teenage girl is bratty, she doesn't want to babysit, she's just, why do we care about her? And then after the picture was finished, he came and screened it in Toronto, where I was working, and I said the same thing. I said, boy, I don't know, just don't get it. And then years later, I started to really appreciate it as a coming-of-age story, which is how I see it now. But it's many things. It's a comedy, it's a puzzle, it's an adventure, and I think you can see it in whatever way resonates with you.
The problem with an answer like this is that it is not fruitful. It does not lead to an understanding of why the film now resonates with people, and furthermore, the film's complexity and possible contradictions must not be excuses to avoid giving the film serious study. It may yet be possible to find a holistic reading of Labyrinth that accounts for its complexities and for the various partial readings the film has spawned. This is my goal with this essay, and to do this, I'd like to back up and look at Labyrinth in context. The history of fantasy cinema is difficult to chronicle because there is no clear way to tell what is or is not a fantasy film. The term fantasy brings the imagery of The Wizard of Oz and The Lord of the Rings to mind, but it can also apply to Pirates of the Caribbean, or Ghostbusters, or Star Wars, or King Kong, or It's a Wonderful Life, or Watermelon Man. So, rather than trying to summarize the history of American fantasy cinema, I would like to focus specifically on what was going on in Hollywood leading up to Labyrinth. However, I do need to back up enough to say that, for most of us, the king of fantasy was always Walt Disney. Disney specialized in a subgenre of fantasy, the fairy tale film, and produced many of the definitive film adaptations of classic magical tales. Then, in 1966, he died, and fantasy cinema was without a father figure. Shortly thereafter, from what I can tell, the special effects-driven wonder films of Ray Harryhausen seemed to lose their relevance as New Hollywood came about, typically rejecting fantastic escapism in favor of realism. In short, the 1970s was a pretty dry spell for fantasy cinema. To quote Frederick S. Clark, founder of Cinefantastique, the fantasy genre during the decade, particularly in the latter half, seemed always on the verge of the type of explosion that horror and science fiction films had undergone, but no such boom ever materialized, probably because no commercial superhit in the genre could be pointed at to catalyze filmmakers into action and investment. On the contrary, there were more than a few commercial and artistic disasters in the field during the 70s that may have served to postpone the entry of a trend in fantasy films that seems to be waiting in the wings. Scholar David Butler concurs in his book Fantasy Cinema: Impossible Worlds on Screen because films such as Excalibur and Conan the Barbarian were in development for much of the 1970s and couldn't quite get produced. Hollywood was too afraid that they wouldn't work. Then, near the end of the decade, suddenly and without warning, Star Wars, no matter how we tend to think of it, is essentially a fantasy film wrapped up in science fiction. It's a heroic epic/adventure film about a boy who meets sword-fighting wizards and saves the princess from the evil lord, complete with its own monsters, mythology, and helpful animal sidekick. Even if it makes sense to call Star Wars primarily science fiction, Star Wars did at least show that the traits of a fantasy film, such as a hero's journey arc, world building, impossible creatures, and magic or mysticism, were economically viable. So what this spawns in the early 1980s is what David Butler calls a fantasy boom. fantasy films of several different kinds were produced in the early 80s, with ripple effects from this wave lasting all the way to 1988 with Willow, and arguably even beyond that. The dominant form of fantasy in this boom would not be the fairy tale adaptation, but the adventure film. Because the fantasy genre was adopted by Lucas, the genre was also adapted by Lucas, and new fantasy films, even when they had little or no science fiction, would typically be operating on Lucas terms. No more would fantasy simply be for children. Even the Walt Disney Company would have to go after a somewhat older audience and try out more adult material.
And you'll be eligible
Because I'm still a virgin.
No more would animation, whether drawn or stop motion, have the monopoly on fantasy. Now it was about practical effects and the new possibilities technology offered for wondrous and dazzling mise-en-scène. Ultimately, this means American filmmakers would be focused, arguably more than ever before in the sound era, on costumes, makeup, and puppets.
It isn't animation anymore. This day and age seems to pursue the live action, the real figures. Could you talk about that shift over the years?
Well, it's interesting. I think some of the things that we're doing in films these days, people are using puppetry where, just maybe 10 years ago, they would have done the same effects in stop motion. But I think it's just the technology has been progressing.
Jim Henson was one of the filmmakers who spent the late 1970s developing ideas for a fantasy adventure film. Henson's daughter Lisa wanted him to construct a world out of timeless fairy tale elements featuring purely heroic heroes and purely villainous villains. This tale became The Dark Crystal, and the inspirations for his fantasy world would be the drawings of Brian Froud, who specialized in drawing fairy tale creatures.
You know, fairies and elves and that world of fantasy is a real world, and he's become an expert in that world.
Again, George Lucas, even if he didn't exactly make a fairy tale in Star Wars, established that the kind of thing Jim Henson wanted to do was possible.
One of the first times Jim and I got together was on a project was when I was doing Empire Strikes Back, and I needed some help with Yoda. Jim was about to do a project after that using more realistic puppetry, and so Yoda became an experiment for him and for me. And we both learned on that project. He went on to do Dark Crystal and advance the art.
What Empire Strikes Back and Dark Crystal would crystallize, pardon the pun, was a new form of animatronic technology that would dominate much of the 1980s. The Dark Crystal did not do well, at least not domestically. It was a bit much for audiences in the United States who weren't ready for a Jim Henson puppet production that felt nothing like The Muppets.
The film was received as a little bit too dry, a little too esoteric, and that people basically came out of Dark Crystal going, wow, it's fantastic, but where's that Henson? So that was the idea, was what the imagination that he was applying to Dark Crystal, can we do that, but can we have the funny back? Can we have all that back? Brian Froud will tell the story differently, so I'm not really entirely sure.
I was in a limousine with Jim Henson and my wife, Wendy, and I had this strong image of the baby surrounded by goblins. His eyes lit up. He said, that sounds great, they're goblins. And he said, well, what's the story? And I said, well, I don't know. I said, and then something popped in my mind, which is a labyrinth. I said, a labyrinth is often symbolic of many things. So if we had a labyrinth in it, it could mean all sorts of things.
So what we have here are two different versions of the same story. Something about the Dark Crystal wasn't quite working, but the visuals and technology were worth continuing in another project. Sources may not agree on what exactly Henson felt needed to change the most, but either way, as Henson said, the next film is going to be different. Henson's approach to filmmaking, or at least to writing films, typically privileged visual artistry and spectacle over narrative logic. When planning The Great Muppet Caper, Henson presented writers Jack Rose and Jerry Jewell with a number of instructions, including homages to classic movie musicals, a positive attitude, big laughs, possibly a chase scene, Kermit trying to solve a mystery, another man trying to win Miss Piggy's heart, and singing Muppets floating down through the sky on parachutes. From this laundry list, the two writers struggled to write a coherent story, and the result did not please Henson, leading him to assign other writers the job of trying to fix the script. The story of the writing of Labyrinth is fairly similar, with Henson focusing on visual moments and story elements he wanted in the film, and hoping the writers he picked for the project would be able to sort out the rest. Henson gave his rough story idea and a few handwritten notes to Dennis Lee, one of the songwriters on Fraggle Rock, who wrote a treatment that, as one might expect from a songwriter, felt like something of a poetic novella. At least that was the view of Monty Python writer Terry Jones, who was brought on by Henson to write a script based on the treatment. Jones ignored the treatment.
I sat at my desk with Vine's drawings stacked on one side of the desk and writing away sort of to see what would happen. And every time I came to a new scene and I needed something to happen, I looked through Vine's drawings and found a character who was kind of speaking to me already, and suddenly there was the scene.
This script was funny, but a bit too random, and Henson seemed to want to give it more heart and more narrative coherence. He decided to give Jones' draft to Fraggle Rock writer Laura Phillips, who moved the focus of the film from wild visuals to emotional relationships, and then Henson attempted to combine these different scripts. As the script still wasn't quite working, and there were only days remaining before they would start filming, Henson took the script, Jones' script, his own treatment of the story, notes from George Lucas, and I'm presuming some of Lee's work and Froud's drawings, and secretly asked Elaine May to work on tying everything together. Very secretly.
Oh, you know about that? How did you know about that? I thought it was always secret that Elaine May was involved. It was at the time. She was not meant to be there. She flew in the dark of night and stayed in our house and worked like in an upper room.
So why have I spent so much time talking about the script? Well, most of the previous essays on this film that I have encountered often take an auteurist approach, asking what Jim Henson was trying to say with the film, even though this is almost certainly bound to lead to confusion given the complex back and forth in the writing process of the film itself. This story is necessarily messy, and there are very few approaches to this film that account for this mess and make something coherent through the interpretation. This makes the film something of a labyrinth itself, and perhaps the best way to solve the labyrinth is to try a few different paths. The first path I propose is the one that seems most in line with what Henson and his creative team have said about the film. It's a story about growing up. This is a coming-of-age story, which, to quote Henson, captures the moment when an adolescent girl realizes she is responsible for her life. The second path is the reason why I needed to explain the context of the film. One of the only other aspects of this film, which nearly everyone who worked on it seems to agree on, is the reaction to the Dark Crystal. Labyrinth is meant to fix the problems of the Dark Crystal, which leads me to suppose that one useful and probably fruitful way to read Labyrinth is as a critical rebuke of the Dark Crystal.
It's not fair! That's right, it's not fair! But that's only half of it!
I will spend relatively little time exploring the path of growing up since it has been handled well in previous writings and commentaries on this film. But there are a few different ways to understand the presentation of maturity in this film, and these should be clarified. The first is the problem of fairness. In her essay, You Couldn't Handle Real Life, The Villains of Labyrinth and Mirror Mask, Jennifer Mara writes, freedom itself isn't enough to make you happy. You also have to be willing to let go of the need to control everything. It is this realization that enlightens Sarah and Helena toward the end of the films. They have been free all along because freedom does not equal absolute control. She later writes, we too find villains in our lives, people we blame for the ills that befall us, people we think make our lives unfair. But they are only as powerful as we make them. Our imaginations and our refusal to take responsibility for ourselves lead us to create monsters out of people just as free and just as responsible as we are. We learn that our suffering and unhappiness come from the desire to make everything fair, to control the world around us, and to make things go our way. As soon as we realize that this is an impossible goal, the suffering and unhappiness will end. This is a very strange reading of Labyrinth, seeing as how the film is about a girl who dislikes her circumstances, namely that her brother has been kidnapped, but refuses to accept them, instead forcing a king to bend to her will, destroying his kingdom as needed along the way. In the context of adulthood and maturity, however, my problem with this reading is that it is simply not clear how learning to steal from your friends and to manipulate others constitutes becoming an adult. This seems like somewhat childish behavior, yet it is the direct result of Sarah's realization that life is not fair.
It's not fair!
No, it isn't. But that's the way it is.
The subject of fairness, then, is one I will return to in a later chapter so I can look at it in a different context. Another form of maturity which seems prominent in the story is responsibility. This makes sense since the story follows a girl who, through dangers untold and hardships unnumbered, does whatever she has to do to get her brother back, like a good babysitter. Here, however, there are still complications. Sarah, of course, is a very bad babysitter at the start of the film, yet once the Goblin King appears, she is willing to do anything for this baby. There is no sense that she got stuck with the job of going through this labyrinth and wishes she could stop, all until she finally sees the value of responsibility and the weight of her actions. Rather, once the baby is gone, she suddenly becomes responsible, and she stays that way for the whole film. Somehow, life's not fair seems to be a bigger lesson learned along the way than responsibility. So what do we make of this? Again, I will return to the theme of responsibility later, but for now, we should ask why Sarah needs to grow up anyway. If she already rises to the challenge when she needs to take responsibility for her actions, or even for her accidental wishes, in what way does she still need to mature? The obvious answer seems to be the way she behaves. From what little we see of Sarah's day-to-day behavior, it is often childlike, which is fine, but also childish, which is undesirable. A useful scene to study might be the moment when she comes home to her parents.
Your father and I go out very rarely.
You go out every single weekend.
I ask you to babysit only if it won't interfere with your plans.
Well, how do you know? You don't know what my plans are. You don't even ask me anymore.
Well, I assume you'd tell me if you had a date. I'd like it if you had a date. You should have dates at your age.
Ah, Sarah, you're home. We were worried about you.
I can't do anything right, can I?
She treats me like a wicked stepmother in a fairy story no matter what I say.
There's something strange about that exchange. Did you notice it? There's a non sequitur here. The stepmother asks if Sarah has plans, to which Sarah retorts, "How would you know if I have plans?" The stepmother replies, "Well, I assume you'd tell me if you had a date. I'd like it if you had a date. You should have dates at your age." Sarah's reaction to this seems very extreme at first, and she continues to be hurt by this exchange later that night.
And she was hurt by the harsh words of her stepmother, and she could no longer stand it.
But what she's reacting to is probably the subtext. In her mind, her plans are to continue playing in the park. But in her family, her plans are supposed to be dating. That's the only activity that justifiably counts as plans. Dating is something that Sarah should do, that she ought to do, according to her authority figures. But she seemingly doesn't want to. She then retreats to her room and puts on lipstick in the mirror, which is adorned with pictures from her birth mother's on-stage romances, all suggesting questions of romance, femininity, and womanhood. Sarah seems to have anxieties about becoming a woman, or questions about what that means, and, as T.S. Miller notes in his essay The Two Kings and the Two Labyrinths, these questions seem overdue now that she is well past the brunt of physical puberty. When her stepmother starts to confront her with these questions and tries to help her become a woman in some sense, she retreats. She surrounds herself with the images of fairy tales where romance is simple and operates on childlike terms. In this space, she is allowed to experience a kind of romance and womanhood vicariously, through the feminine figures in her surrounding literature and imagery, while still retaining her childhood. For Sarah, fantasy is not just a part of childhood that she has not yet let go. It is best understood as her way of keeping herself from growing up. Before assessing Sarah's experiences within the fantasy world, let's look at Sarah's fantasies in her home life, which I have categorized as 3 methods of fantasizing. The first method is immersing herself in a fantasy-based environment. In her bedroom, she has surrounded herself in fantasy books, ranging from The Wizard of Oz to the works of the Brothers Grimm to multiple Marie Sendak books. Additionally, she has plush dolls and figurines of characters which will come to life later in the film, she has images of Disney characters and impossible places, and she has a princess music box that will become prominent later. While this could be read as an interest in fantasy literature, Sarah has a particular obsession with her collection of various stuffed animals, most of which are not related to fantasy in any meaningful way: a walrus, a rabbit, a horse, and many teddy bears. This is not simply fandom of literature, it is an attachment to her childhood. According to Jennifer Mara's essay mentioned before, Sarah wishes she could be a normal teenager. But I see no evidence supporting Mara's claim in the film. On the contrary, Sarah has built a fortress of childhood imagery to protect her from the forces of adulthood and to keep her from becoming a normal teenager. Her second method of fantasizing is narrativizing her life.
Once upon a time, there was a beautiful young girl whose stepmother always made her stay home with the baby. And the baby was a spoiled child, and he wanted everything for himself, and the young girl was practically a slave. But what no one knew was that the king of the goblins had fallen in love with the girl, and he had given her certain powers.
She may not be able to live in one of her fantasies, but she uses fantasy narratives as a template to help her organize her own emotions.
She treats me like a wicked stepmother in a fairy story no matter what I say.
This works well enough until she tries applying her favorite story to her own life, and this leads to trouble. Her third way of escaping into fantasy is with performance. What she's reciting in the park, I assume, is her favorite play. She continues performing this key scene in her bedroom while wearing other costume pieces and putting on makeup, and gets into character again, even doing a voice for the goblins, when she tells Toby a story based on the play. Putting all of these together, we see that she uses performance to make herself into fairy tale characters, uses her toys and books to make her room a fairy tale environment, and uses narrativization to combine all aspects of her life into a fairy tale. Still, this fairy tale life is but a fabrication of hers, a fantasy, and is therefore not satisfying to her. But there is a noticeable change in her behavior when she is taken away to the fantasy realm. Instead of whining and throwing a fit, as she had when her simple task was to keep an eye on the baby, she looks at the far greater task of traveling through the labyrinth to the castle beyond the Goblin City with positivity and confidence.
Doesn't look that hard. Well, come on, feet.
When she spent her time trying to use her 3 methods of fantasizing to adapt her circumstances to fit her fantasies, she was unhappy, and when her stepmother wanted her to go on a date and adapt herself to her circumstances, she was also unhappy. Once she was in the fantasy realm, her circumstances, for the first time, adapted to her fantasies, so she could finally adapt herself to her circumstances with ease. Unfortunately for her, what she faces includes not only her fantasies, what she longs for, but also her desires, which are exactly what she's been trying to avoid addressing. She's built a solid, elaborate fortress of fantasy for herself, but her sexual desires break through anyway. Enter David Bowie.
First, here's this Jareth. He's the Goblin King. He's scary. He's a bad guy. He's got my little brother. And then this weird tension comes in with, yeah, but he's also masculine. I'm attracted to him. He's male, I'm female, but I'm a child. I wanted to be an adult. I don't want to be an adult, if that's what it means. That is tough and delicate material that you have to, work with carefully, and also extremely important. I mean, it's also a big part of any, young teenager's life is they're starting to figure out sexuality and their urges and all that, and it's scary, and you can step wrong if you're not careful how you tread. And ultimately, Sarah as a character, because Jareth keeps saying, come on.
For as long as Sarah's desires and intentions are in conflict, Jareth's desires and intentions are in conflict. For as long as what Sarah wants is in flux, the role of Jareth will be in flux, and the whole labyrinth will be in flux. Jareth is masculine, yes, but he is also feminine, and he must remain androgynous for as long as Sarah is still working out her desires. It is easy to ask what Jareth really wants from Sarah, but the more important question is what Sarah wants from Jareth. Until she figures out what she wants, Jareth has to be a confused and confusing character. But the film doesn't actually answer the question of what her sexual desires really are, at least not explicitly, not in its conclusion. So perhaps Sarah's journey to understanding her own sexuality is not so much about what she wants from Jareth as what she wants from herself. With that, it's time to switch gears and talk about the Dark Crystal and fairy tales. The Dark Crystal was called a solemn fairy tale and watered down J.R.R. Tolkien by critics, who typically found the film's story too standard and predictable. The story is everything that one expects from a fairy tale film with few surprises, and its fealty to this literary genre does not necessarily work to the film's advantage. The fairy tale has historically been a problematic genre, so The Dark Crystal inherited some of those problems. As scholar Maria Tatar explains in Off With Their Heads, Fairy Tales and the Culture of Childhood, it is generally disadvantageous for the young hero or heroine of a fairy tale to raise too many questions. Disobedience is generally a function of curiosity and stubbornness in the behavioral calculus of most folklore collections, and both vices are repeatedly singled out for punishment in cautionary tales. Such tales, which enunciate a prohibition, stage its violation, and put on display the punishment of the violator, are surely the most openly violent and didactic of all children's stories. They aim to mold behavior by illustrating in elaborate detail the dire consequences of deviant conduct. Bear in mind that while Tatar is specifically writing on cautionary tales in this quote, a focus on obedience is something found in an abundance of fairy tales. Instilling the value of obedience in children was no small part of the project of Charles Perrault and the Brothers Grimm. When approaching the fairy tale, one must remember that the Brothers Grimm imbued their tales with a heavy dose of Christian morality, the Protestant work ethic, and patriarchalism, hoping to spread what they considered essential German values. We should not be surprised, then, by the way these stories propagate a religious kind of faith, sometimes very explicitly. Consider Tatar's example of the Grimm story, Mary's Child. In this tale, a girl of about Sarah's age is tested by the Virgin Mary with a key to the 13 doors of heaven. The girl is permitted to open 12, not all 13, but eventually her curiosity overtakes her. Consequently, she is punished by being cast into the wilderness, unable to speak, and is trapped by thorny hedges that appear wherever she tries to run away. Like Adam and Eve, Tatar writes, Mary's child gives in to temptation and is expelled from paradise. Her offense becomes tainted with all the disagreeable connotations of biblical transgression and original sin. After her fall from innocence and grace, she survives only by the sweat of her brow. That a child's curiosity should be linked with the fall and punished in so severe a manner may appear odd to us, but it happens all the time in children's fairy tales. The context offered by Tatar makes the scene in which Sarah takes the poisonous fruit particularly interesting. As Tatar shows, this invocation of the biblical forbidden fruit scenario is typically representative of the pernicious temptation to disobey. But Labyrinth turns this on its head. Sarah is never commanded or warned not to eat the fruit, as she would be in a cautionary fairy tale, but she is shown throughout the film that Hoggle, as well-meaning as he may be, is not to be trusted. The fruit becomes a test of her skepticism, not of her faith, and it is her lack of skepticism that leads her straight into Jareth's trap. In The Dark Crystal, the story is one grand act of obedience. Jen's master gives him a command with very little explanation, and it is vital that Jen do whatever is required to obey his master.
Oh, Master, I'll go where you send me, though I barely understand.
Labyrinth, by contrast, is the opposite, a grand act of defiance.
Sarah, go back to your room. Play with your toys and your costumes. Forget about the baby.
I can't.
Don't defy me.
More importantly, what Sarah is going to have to learn on her journey is not to have too much faith. Despite the values of the traditional fairy tale, this story values logic and skepticism. The trick to solving this labyrinth is not going to be doing what she is told.
Don't go on.
And it's not even trusting her instincts.
Goodbye! Well, I'm not afraid. Things aren't always what they seem in this place.
The trick is questioning things, and questioning them the right way. To understand why I see this as a rebuke of the Dark Crystal, just compare these two clips, one from each film.
Aughra, what do I do with the shard?
Heal the Dark Crystal.
But how?
Questions, questions, too many questions. You want a shard? Here.
60.
I said, where is it?
Where is what?
The door.
What door?
It's hopeless asking you anything.
Not if you ask the right questions.
How do I get into the labyrinth?
Ah, now that's more like it.
This is a striking philosophical turnaround, and it puts a new key issue on the table to discuss, the issue of questioning. Recognizing this feature of the film opens up a new door to better ways of understanding Labyrinth. The first character Sarah meets on her journey is Hoggle, a creature identical to a bookend in her bedroom, only now he is peeing in a pool of water. Her first encounter with the character from her fantasy immediately disgusts her, and he is no happier to see her.
Oh, it's you.
Somehow, just as the characters in the Labyrinth are all familiar to Sarah, she is familiar to some of them as well.
I'm Hoggle. Who are you?
Sarah.
That's what I thought.
They don't seem to be on good terms. One might see this as detailing the relationship between Sarah and the Labyrinth, a sign that everything in the Labyrinth comes from her subconscious or her fantasies. Of course, most everything in the Labyrinth relates to Sarah's 3 methods of fantasizing mentioned earlier. Even the architecture reflects the game in her bedroom and the park where she likes to play. But what must not be overlooked is that this fantasy world is in decay. Things are breaking, there are cobwebs everywhere, nasty dead tree branches are sticking out of the walls. The place feels long abandoned.
Oh, please. I haven't said it for such a long time.
This would lead the viewer to suppose this is an age of not believing kind of story. Maybe Sarah's lack of belief as she has grown older has caused the land of her fantasies to die. Maybe she just needs to believe harder and clap for Tinkerbell and everything will be solved. Or so one might initially think. But this first encounter in Labyrinth's Fantasyland frames Sarah's journey in precisely the opposite light.
Oh, how sweet.
57.
How could you?
Yeah.
Poor thing. You monster.
Huh?
It bit me.
What did you expect fairies to do?
I thought they did nice things, like granting wishes.
Huh? Shows what you know, don't it?
Unlike in other fantasy stories, our heroine is not supposed to believe in magical fairies, or at least she isn't supposed to believe they are what her fairy tale books say they are. She later has her preconceived notions of fairy tale worlds shattered when she tries to use lipstick markings to trace her path through the labyrinth, a variation on Hansel and Gretel's breadcrumbs, and this fails when the creatures living under the road turn the stones she marked upside down. The remainder of the main cast also challenges her expectations. The scary monster is not scary, the brave knight is a loser, the wise man is a con man, the talking animal guide sends Sarah the wrong way, the ballroom dancers are goblins, the epic battle is just silly, and the love interest is the villain. Jareth uses her convictions about what her fairy tale story must be to distract her, making her a princess in a beautiful masked ball, hindering her from completing her journey. Even in the film's climax, her decision to leave her friends behind because that's the way it's done leaves her isolated and singular in an environment where Jareth has the advantage of multiplicity, an advantage Sarah sacrificed just for the sake of a good story. This makes little sense for a film trying to celebrate fairy tale literature, but it fits in nicely with the film's crash course in critical thinking. In stark contrast to the values of the average Hollywood film, Sarah's problem is not that she lacks faith or asks too many questions, but the opposite. She has too much confidence in her presumptions and asks the wrong questions. Note the first piece of advice that Hoggle gives Sarah in the labyrinth.
You know your problem. You take too many things for granted.
This is one of the few lines of dialogue that are repeated throughout the film. Unlike the line, "You have no power over me," the motif of taking too many things for granted is not spaced out across the film's runtime. It actually comes up only 2 minutes later.
What do they mean, labyrinth? There aren't any turns or corners or anything. This just goes on and on. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe I'm just taking it for granted that it does.
Then, just 2 minutes after that, it is repeated in her conversation with the worm.
Things are not always what they seem in this place, so you can't take anything for granted.
This is a good sign that this idea is important to our understanding of the film. Sarah must learn not to be too confident in her assumptions and not to be too trusting, even of her own judgment. When she makes the decision to trust Hoggle, even if only because she sees no alternative,
What choice have you got?
she is immediately let down when he tries to abandon her. By contrast, when she is less faithful and more logical, using good reasoning or creative thinking to figure things out, she always gets to proceed.
Okay, let's handle this thing logically. What exactly have you sworn?
I have sworn with my life blood. No one shall pass this way without my permission.
Well, may we have your permission?
Now, the scene with the guards at the door seems to be a counterexample. This is the moment when she relies the most on her reasoning, yet she still seems to fail.
No, it's right. I figured it out. I can never do it before. I think I'm getting smarter. This is a piece of cake.
My argument here is that she does not fail. She does solve the puzzle, and what she faces when she goes through the door is not certain death. The helping hands give her the choice of going back up to safety, but instead she goes down into the oubliette, only to be shown a door by Hoggle. This is far from certain death, but it does seem to be punishing her for something she did wrong. The clue to what that something is comes a few minutes later.
How are you enjoying my labyrinth?
It's a piece of cake.
Here, she has given the wrong answer and is punished accordingly.
So the labyrinth's a piece of cake, is it? Well, let's see how you deal with this little slice.
The way I see it, it is the same line that gets her into trouble at the doors.
It's a piece of cake!
Sarah's arrogance here is antithetical to the principles of good critical thinking. As Richard Feynman once said of scientific research, the first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. Once Sarah believes she can't be fooled, that she is smart enough to see through all of Jareth's tricks, she becomes a worse critical thinker, and in fact makes herself more vulnerable to Jareth's tricks. In short, Sarah learns to have a healthy skepticism, particularly in regards to the temptations of her own fantasies, and this makes another of the film's oft-repeated lines, "That's not fair," make more sense.
It's not fair.
You say that so often. I wonder what your basis for comparison is.
Her basis of comparison, most likely, is her favorite fantasies and fairy tale stories, where everything always works out in the end. Sarah's realization that the labyrinth does not operate on the fair terms of her fantasies actually empowers her to recognize traps and tricks and overcome them. Her lesson, then, is not that she must simply accept things as they are because life's not fair. Rather, recognizing unfairness can help her challenge any obstacles in her path. This means she can rely less on fairy tale logic protecting her, and more on her own critical thinking empowering her. So, is Sarah ever told not to think by anyone in the labyrinth? Does Jareth ever explicitly tell her to be unreasonable? Well, he does tell her to forget. And that is one way of telling her not to think, but from what I can tell, Jareth does not encourage her explicitly to think less. He does, however, openly accuse Hoggle of being unreasonable.
I won't do nothing to harm her.
Oh, come, Hogbrain. I'm surprised at you losing your head over a girl.
I ain't lost my head.
This is an interesting choice of words, because in the very next scene, Sarah is told to lose her head.
Take off her head! Yeah, let's take off
Daddy, that's his head.
The Fireys tell Sarah in their song that she should think small, advertising their life of ease with no responsibilities. These are partiers who simply give in to their wild urges and enjoy sexual pleasures. This is about as close to a thoughtless life as I can imagine, and it's interesting that these are also the characters most actively trying to render Sarah incapable of continuing her journey. Of course, there is nothing particularly tempting about these characters in the way they live, which is to be expected. Sarah reads, you watch video essays, we're smart people. A thoughtless life, when offered explicitly, is not very tempting to us. It's rather off-putting. But there are more diabolical ways of keeping Sarah from thinking for herself. And these are traps we can fall for too. The opening credits to Labyrinth present a few visual motifs that will come up time and time again in this film. The first, even before the owl, is the crystal ball. When the owl appears, it enters a maze, and its reflection appears on the wall. As the owl continues to follow its reflection, he eventually dives into it, as though the reflection was not from a mirror, but from some sort of body of water. Bodies of water appear throughout the rest of the film, as do mirrors, and of course crystal balls. What all of these have in common is that they show reflections. They show images of oneself. We should ask what the purpose of these reflections is in this story. But first, let's return to the theme of performance. Both Sarah and Jareth are performers, as is Sarah's mother and Sarah's mother's love interest, who is also played by David Bowie. But the word performance can also refer to how one behaves and what he/she accomplishes or carries out, which is the kind of performance that the likes of Perrault and the Grimms attempted to shape with their writings. It is this social kind of performance that creates the tension between Sarah and her stepmother. Sarah is not performing like a typical teenager. Furthermore, Sarah doesn't want to learn who she's supposed to be from her stepmother, but from her birth mother. Here we see the first function of the mirror in the film. Sarah's mother is out of the picture, so Sarah puts herself into the mother's picture. She uses the mirror to join the images of herself and her mother, showing her longing to be part of this other family. She is even giving herself a more theatrical appearance to match her mother's theatrical appearance on stage, suggesting that she wants her sense of how she is supposed to perform, her sense of her role as a woman, to come from her mother. Without her mother, she has not made the transition into womanhood. From where I stand, this is why she is overdue. Now, Jareth blurs the lines between these two kinds of performance. His role in life is confined to his role in the narrative, which is primarily to be the villain. He clearly does care for Sarah. But she is the hero, and the hero needs a villain, so he does his best to put on a good show and be a menacing threat.
You cowered before me. I was frightening. I have reordered time. I have turned the world upside down, and I have done it all for you. I am exhausted from living up to your expectations.
Sarah's role, in the social sense of the word, is what she needs to figure out, and Jareth offers Sarah the chance to explore this within a world built out of her own childhood fantasies. For Jareth, however, the question of Sarah's role as a woman seems to be in sexual terms. Where the theme of sex is most prominent is in the ballroom scene, in which, to quote T.S. Miller's essay, dripping candles, outsized wands, a serpentine staff, and protuberant noses and horns adorning all of the masks further accent Jareth's always prominent genital bulge. Part of what makes this scene interesting is its context in the film. This sequence presents the most adult part of the film, yet it is immediately followed by Sarah's retreat back to her plush dolls and childhood games. These scenes are worth comparing because they present reflections, the images of the self, in two different ways, each ending with the image being shattered. In the ballroom scene, a collection of Sarah's ideas of what adulthood is supposed to be come together at once. First, there is the image provided by her fairy tales of the princess in the ballroom. For once, she gets to become the princess she has always imagined herself to be. Second, Sarah finally goes on a date, just not with a boy of her own age. It's with a much older man. Third, that older man is David Bowie, the rock star and teen idol, making him the kind of man teenage girls imagine themselves marrying someday. This is the version of adulthood that one imagines. It is a child's idea of adulthood, and what follows is an adult's memories of childhood.
The junk people, I didn't understand at all. When I was 22 and I just thought they were really cool. I didn't understand it. It's not until you're an older adult that you understand about the baggage of life, and trying not to have it all sitting on your shoulders. And now, as I watch Labyrinth now as an adult, I have a huge appreciation for how wonderfully clever the junk woman and the junk people are, as well as how actually right on the nose it was.
Well, look here.
What's interesting is it's a metaphor. There's not really a metaphor at all. It's just saying this is exactly what people do, and it's a really big mistake.
Just as Jareth presents Sarah with a hallucinogenic fantasy, the junk lady presents Sarah with a hallucinogenic mirage, teasing her with the safety and security of her fortress of fantasy, but actually trying to keep her stuck here. All of the junk people are so buried in their junk that they can hardly move, and the junk lady begins to bury Sarah the same way. Suddenly her childhood fantasies become something that weigh her down. As opposed to previous readings of this scene, mine does not suppose any anti-consumerist message must be the main point of this scene, as that has almost no relationship to everything else in the film. The way I see it, her childhood fantasies and nostalgia are being used to keep her from moving, to literally, physically trap her in her childhood stage. But the junk lady also seems to understand the importance of Sarah's images of herself.
Oh, here's a treasure. You'll want that, won't you, my dear? Yes, go on, put it on, make yourself up.
This is an important part of the trap, and when the trap fails, the junk lady resorts to a more powerful image of Sarah.
Well, what about this? This is not junk.
And we hear the same song we heard in the last scene, and we see the same dress we saw in the last scene. Note that the image of the physical music box itself is what pulls Sarah into the crystal ball in the ballroom sequence. This is the image of what Sarah, according to the fairy tale, is meant to become. By contrast, in The Dark Crystal, Jen encounters an image depicting an ancient story that is supposedly about him. He learns exactly what his role is in the narrative, and the way he performs this role is by conforming to the image of who he is supposed to be. This is what makes The Dark Crystal a fairy tale to a fault. It continues this idea that performing one's role as predetermined by old narratives and images is what will bring freedom. It doesn't even matter if the image was really meant for Jen. The idea that Jen is the last remaining Gelfling has been disproven, but he conforms to the rules of the story anyway. The story isn't even coherent. Supposedly, these glowing beings destroyed the crystal, and this separated them into the Skeksis and the Mystics, but we clearly see that a Skeksis, post-separation, is what destroyed the crystal. Nothing about what we've been told in this film can be trusted, but Jen trusts anyway, and he is rewarded for his trust. In Labyrinth, the images from fairy tale stories are not what free Sarah, but what weigh her down and trap her. Both Jareth and the junk lady try to shape the image of Sarah in order to shape her behavior. Sarah is freed when the image of herself is broken, and that is an empowering theme that is easy to miss. Consider the crystal ball. Historically, the purpose of the crystal ball is to conjure images, to see things, and this is true in this film, but we also see crystal balls used to create images. Jareth uses a crystal ball to create this new image of Sarah as a princess to give her a Cinderella fantasy inside the crystal ball, complete with the clock striking 12. One might even say that the only reason why the crystals turn into bubbles is to give this little visual illusion that solidifies the connection to Cinderella. This scene is also sort of connected to a fairy tale adaptation by Henson himself. In Henson's version of The Frog Prince, breaking the villain's crystal ball is what breaks her curse over the princess, and also what removes the more glamorous image she had created of herself.
My power! You've destroyed my power! She turned into a bird.
Here, Sarah is trapped inside of a crystal ball, and when she breaks it, she is at the same time breaking this warped image of herself and breaking the fantasy from her Disney fairy tales that Jareth was using against her. In this way, this is a very accurate depiction of what it can be like shattering one's fantasies. It can feel like the world is falling apart, and all that remains is worthless junk. Fortunately, when Sarah denies the root of her fantasy, the images and narratives that give her this fantasy, she is then freed to finish her quest. One last point of comparison to The Dark Crystal. In that film, crystals also serve the function of showing images, changing appearances, and shaping how the characters behave. But Jen is a hero for healing the crystal. In Labyrinth, Sarah's final act before she returns home, right when she defeats Jareth, is destroying the crystal.
Sarah, are you home?
Yeah. Yes, I'm home.
Goodbye, Sarah.
Should you need us,
Yes, should you need us, for any reason at all.
I need you, Hoggle.
You do?
I don't know why, but every now and again in my life, for no reason at all, I need you. All of you.
You do? Well, why didn't you say so?
What do I even say now? This is the film's conclusion. Random characters appear in Sarah's bedroom dressed for Mardi Gras. Some are wearing birthday hats. They are having a loud party in her house while her parents are home. And believe it or not, her parents are probably the most bizarre aspect of this scene due to the fact that we never see them in it. Consider The Wizard of Oz, which is clearly a source of inspiration for Labyrinth. Its concluding message, "There's no place like home," first implies the home is a happy place to be and one should learn to love it for its own sake. There is a sense that the desires to go over the rainbow are fine so long as one learns to accept and love real life in all of its bleak, colorless blandness. Secondly, though, it implies that being home is about being with one's family. In Labyrinth, the return home seems disheartening for Sarah, and there is no interest in reuniting with her family. All of that conflict with her stepmother at the beginning of the film goes unresolved, at least on the surface. We never hear either character speak another word to the other. Instead, Sarah resolves her relationship with her fantasy. And in almost the opposite move as what one finds in The Wizard of Oz, she says she needs her fantasy, and she throws herself into it. Now, let's hear what the internet has to say about this.
When she gets to the castle, she makes all her fantasy friends wait outside while she goes into the Goblin King's room alone because she says,
"That's the way it's done."
And all of her friends wait outside and they say, "We'll be here waiting should you need us." She learns right then that she doesn't have to give up her childhood completely just to be a woman, and she doesn't have to choose to just be a child forever.
So what exactly does that mean? I do want to agree with this video that the film is about this ability to make complex choices about fantasy and adulthood, choosing not to surrender childhood entirely, but also not to surrender to it entirely, choosing not to live without fantasy, but also not to live without realism. The problem here is that fantasy seems to be a need for Sarah. It seems to be inescapable, even though that would almost outright contradict the point of the film's climax.
You have no power over me.
In this scene, which is perhaps the most important in the film, Sarah looks one fantasy in the eye and establishes her power over it, only to look at other fantasies moments later and confess her helpless need for them. It is true that, according to the plot, Jareth is the bad fantasy and Hoggle and Ludo are good ones, but we see a mix of good and bad characters in her bedroom. It appears that she needs both. Also, keep in mind that Jareth is the more mature, adult fantasy in a sense, contrasted with the fantasies of childhood that Sarah chooses over him, and that complicates the message about growing up, doesn't it? Maybe, but let's look again at Jareth's offer.
Just let me rule you, and you can have everything that you want. Just fear me, love me, do as I say, and I will be your slave.
Jareth contradicts himself here, and it's a very interesting kind of contradiction in that one can almost see why it would sound sensible to Jareth. An addiction, for example, to something like drugs or alcohol can be understood as something that rules the user it serves. What Jareth offers is essentially the same. I will give you this fantasy, this escape, this satisfaction you have been seeking, so long as it is on my terms. Jareth is powerful in that he is the creator, provider, and facilitator of Sarah's fantasies, and this is a very pernicious kind of power. It's the kind that Disney had. Between Charles Perrault, the Brothers Grimm, and Walt Disney, Sarah's capacity to want, to wish, and to fantasize has entirely been on the terms of others, not on her own. All of Sarah's romantic longings and wishful thinking became a way for Jareth to exercise power over her because she had already been letting these ideas and their authors have power over her throughout her life. In her 3 methods of fantasizing, she shapes her environment to align with these ideas, she makes her performance, in both senses, align with these ideas, and she tries to make the story of her life fit into the framework of these ideas. She has always been ruled by the kings of fantasy, and Jareth is just another fantasy king trying to rule her. In this shot, his castle even looks something like a warped Disneyland, which makes sense. Jareth is a man offering to make her dreams come true, and he conveniently is in the business of molding what those fantasies are to his own liking, of crafting the fantasies he intends to satisfy. But in this moment, Sarah sees that Jareth actually needs her permission to rule her, meaning she had the power.
What power?
The power of choice.
What choice?
The choice to make choices. Yes, everyone needs fantasies. They're an important part of life. And everyone also needs to engage with the existing fantasy literature in the culture because it's a dominant force in our society. But these needs don't make us powerless. It's up to us to fantasize responsibly, to make choices about how much and in what ways we will let fantasies, whether personal fantasies or literary fantasies, govern our behavior and thinking. Taking a critical approach to the fairy tales of the Brothers Grimm can make them enjoyable without letting the 18th and 19th century ideas dictate who we have to be. It is possible to enjoy the story of Cinderella without enjoying patriarchy because of the discernment that comes with being a good critical thinker. It is this critical thinking that Sarah learns on her journey. Ask good questions, think things through logically, remember your priorities, beware of deception, ask for clarification, and don't let yourself get too big-headed. With the ability to think clearly, she can see what was a needless source of stress before and let it go. She can set aside images of herself that don't reflect who she wants to be and focus on those that matter to her. And yes, she can enjoy the good and the bad, the brave and the cowardly, the wise and the wild all at once, knowing that she is the one with the power to balance her life and her fantasies as needed. Remember that quote from Jim Henson about responsibility? He doesn't say that Sarah learns to be more responsible or learns the value of behaving responsibly. Rather, she learns that she is responsible for her life. It's up to her to make good choices about how she will act and about how she will let other forces govern or influence her thinking, whether they be societal forces or literary ones. So it turns out that both of the two paths, the path of maturity and the path of critique, actually lead to the same place, the value of choice. I understand why people might have a hard time appreciating the film for its message, which seems at first to be messy, ambiguous, or altogether absent. But there is an important idea at the heart of this film that makes it truly beautiful. Sure, Labyrinth may look like nothing more than another silly 80s movie, but then again, you can't always take things for granted.